Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to one of the last videos in the progressive period where we look at Wilson and the First World War and see how dramatically it changed America and how in the 1920s they're going to look to return to normalcy from the rugged individualism that we've seen in the past. So by the end of today we'll be able to look at how it impacts America. Woodrow Wilson was very much on the side of moral diplomacy. He appoints William Jennings Bryan, our good old friend, to be Secretary of State, and they together are pacifists. They believe firmly that America has a responsibility to improve the lives of foreign people through example, and they call this policy moral diplomacy. That has two main targets. Contact with the USA could only benefit others, and it was morally superior and benevolent in comparison. And we see this operation in Latin America, where he declares he would only cooperate with just governments. That is not governments that have been taken over by revolution or coup, just those elected democratically. And he says to support the orderly processes of just government based upon law and not upon arbitrary or irregular forces. And we see in Latin America go on a building spree of highways, airfields, schools, hospitals. He intervenes in Haiti after a revolution in 1915, and we see that an attempt at a revolution isn't justified, it isn't supported. In Dominican Republic, it's placed under US governance in 1915. So we've got evidence of his moral diplomacy here. Now, in 1914, when World War I breaks out in Europe, the American public obviously see this as across the Atlantic and not their problem. American support is very high for staying out. Wilson campaigned for neutrality and pacifism, and that is his slogan in 1916, that he kept us out of the war, and he's voted in by droves. The USA enters the war in 1917 as an associated power, which means it's not formally allied and it remains independent. And we're going to get to why it entered in 1917 and not in 1914 in a bit. Why were they neutral? Public opinion. The US citizens said the war had nothing to do with them. We see 1,500 women march in New York City to protest in 1914 as evidence of this public opinion, and William Jennings Bryan actively campaigns against it. He could not be seen to go against the Secretary of State as president. And lastly, we've got Wilsonianism. Wilson himself sought neutrality. He envisaged himself being the peace broker, and we see that he tried to send envoys to create peace from 1914 to 1917. And he declares America neutral in 1915, which means they will trade freely with Britain and the Allied forces and Germany and the Axis. There is also, though, this pro-British feeling deep within Wilson. Publicly, he supports them perhaps more so than the Central Powers. He favours the Allies and he fears Germany was a threat to US interests. Remember, in Samoa, America and Germany had already had conflict. Germany now has control of Western Samoa as part of its empire, and that worries the rest of Latin America and therefore worries America itself. Trade is one of the reasons why America stands neutral. It benefits undoubtedly from trade with the Allies and the Central Powers. However, it does predominantly trade with the Allies, as we can see in these exports and surplus tables. The USA wanted to maintain trade as it benefited from the tariffs, and the federal government received its money through that trade. It stood at $3.2 billion by 1916, and that is 10 times that of the Central Powers. The Allies had also borrowed $7 billion from the USA, and that would eventually rise to $10.5 billion. So when America do eventually come into the war, you may be able to tell which side they may be leaning towards. One of the other reasons for neutrality is unrestricted submarine warfare. In February 1915, Germany declared British waters a war zone, which means any ship, American or otherwise, that ventures in may be targeted. After the sinking of 2 British ships, including the ship Arabic, with the loss of 2 American lives, Germany abandoned this policy, which again means that America can remain neutral. Now, in 1917, they revert this policy, and it's one of the reasons why America goes to war then. Why did it enter? We've got the failure of the peace initiatives. Wilson wanted to bring about peace much earlier. He sent envoys to Europe twice with no luck. If he couldn't do it personally, then maybe America needed to join in. Resumption of unrestricted warfare, as we've already said. US ships were sunk by German U-boats. The public mood switched, and America were able to join. German activities in the USA, there was a lot of alleged German-American espionage. This was no doubt as an exaggeration, but the public mood in America turned against the German-Americans. Remember, in some states, large German-American populations existed, and they started to be turned against. And lastly, we've got the controversial Zimmermann telegram. Now, this was a coded telegram from Germany to Mexico that was passed on to America by Britain. What motive may Britain have had to have sent this telegram to them? And it proposed a secret alliance between Germany and Mexico that allegedly Germany would receive many of the states if the war was won by the Central Powers, and Mexico would receive the southern states that had previously been taken them from previous wars. So a question we've got to ask ourselves, is it a moral crusade or is it an economic cause? Are the USA motivated by the large debts that they wish to receive in the future, or are they there for a purpose of morality? How does World War I affect them? It affects them in a number of ways. Initially, America is not prepared for war production, and we see this in evidence in Hogg's shipyard in Philadelphia, where by the end of the war it fails to complete a single ship. Despite that being a huge site with over 4,000 employees, they do not complete a ship. Additionally, we see that America is prepared to use thousands and thousands of munitions, and very few of them are actually produced in America itself. They're purchased back off of the Allies. War costs over $33 billion. Additionally, $7 billion is lent to the Allies, so $40 billion. It is a huge cost for America, and that's raised through loans such as the Liberty and Victory loans, as well as war bonds, and the government collected taxes of $10.5 billion. Wilson initially creates the War Industries Board that is coordinating and almost nationalising some of the finance and supplies that America needs. Railroads are centralised, and agriculture comes under Herbert Hoover, who we'll look at later. We've got the passing of the Lever Food and Control Act, and food production rises, and so does farmers' income. So there's a benefit. 1 million workers are called up for World War I. Now, that should have been an opportunity for women, and it should have been an opportunity for African Americans, but few women replaced them, and over 500,000 American Africans moved north in a mass migration. Cities such as Chicago experienced huge influx of African Americans, whereas previously there'd been a handful of thousand. There was now tens of thousands of African Americans in these cities, and of course that leads to serious race riots that we've looked at previously. So America is undoubtedly changed by World War I. When it ends, Wilson has his opportunity to be the peacemaker, and we have the Paris Peace Conference that leads to the passing of the Treaty of Versailles. In fact, his work and efforts lead to the 1919 Nobel Peace Prize, but he shortly dies afterwards. It's said that he's working 18-hour days. He has 3 strokes, with the final one taking its toll, and he dies soon afterwards. This is something that he gave literally his life for. His 14 points were there to create lasting peace in Europe, and it was built on 3 premises: the avoidance of war, self-determination, and the creation of the League of Nations. Now, this is a man that wanted to create a police force for the rest of the world that would intervene in national disputes if and when they occurred. The League of Nations, though, was his brainchild, and as such he refused to compromise. He had opportunities for the USA to join the League of Nations, but it was never going to do so, as it was defeated in the Senate in 1919 for votes 49 to 55. Wilson told the Democrats to oppose previous compromises that were proposed by the Senate. So you can see how dedicated he was to his version of peace. Ultimately, though, America and the First World War really changes the perception. They've seen the horrors of war firsthand, not the Civil War, but a genuine war of attrition. Hundreds of thousands of Americans die, the least of all of the Allied powers, but significant enough for America to change their stance in the future. And we'll look at the 1920s to 1945 as how America is changed significantly by this. So we will be able to, by the end of this video, describe some of the reasons for US neutrality. We've got public opinion, Wilsonianism, etc. The tension increases over time because of Germany's actions, because of the money lent to people, and ultimately we can evaluate how badly affected America was by World War I, how ill prepared it was, how much money was costing, how many lives were lost, and how Wilson tried but failed ultimately in his goal to secure peace in our times. Thank you very much. Remember to comment, subscribe, and like the video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you very much.